Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. This week on the show, none other than professor, author, intellectual extraordinaire Noam Chomsky on everything from Iraq to Ferguson to China and trade. And a sneak peek at a documentary on a workers' struggle that won. It's all coming up right here. Welcome to the show. It's hard to find anyone on the U.S. left who has not been influenced by our next guest. He's an accomplished linguist whose work has transformed his field. He's a political theorist and the author of more than 100 books, the subject of many movies. And he's not just a committed public intellectual, he's an activist. He shows up on campuses where the action is and draws a crowd. Noam Chomsky is our guest in this special interview recorded in New York. Noam, welcome to the program. Glad to have you. President Obama picked the 10th anniversary of the U.S. Battle of Fallujah to announce a doubling of the U.S. troop presence in Iraq. Some of those troops going back to Anbar province, where Fallujah is situated. People talk about the crisis of ISIS, the lack of good options. Is this how you see it?
It's interesting to look at it carefully. Fallujah, first of all, was one of the worst atrocities of the 21st century. The Iraq War itself was the worst crime of the 21st century, easily. Fallujah was probably the worst war crime carried out during that war. The Marines, 7,000 Marines attacked Fallujah, probably killed everyone who was there. They called them insurgents, but whatever that means. The first day of the invasion of Fallujah, you take a look at the New York Times, had a front page photograph of Marines breaking into the General Hospital, which is a war crime, throwing all the patients on the floor and shackling them, throwing the doctors on the floor. It was hailed as a triumph. Yeah. When the high command was asked why they broke into the hospital, they had an explanation. They said it was a propaganda center for the insurgents. It was releasing casualty figures, and therefore it's legitimate to carry out a major war crime. Apparently pretty exotic weapons were used there, and there's evidence which international agencies don't want to look at of high levels of cancer, other effects of maybe depleted uranium, maybe something else. It's a major atrocity. But it's hailed here as a victory. The only way it is referred to now is as a tragedy, because the Marines fought so hard to liberate Fallujah, and now ISIS is in control of it. I mean, you don't know what to say.
So what would you do if you were president?
If ISIS? First of all, ISIS is a monstrosity. There isn't a conceivable way of dealing it. It's kind of hard to imagine, following the law. I say that cautiously because it's such an outrageous idea. But there are laws, and we're bound by them. They're actually, the Constitution requires that we adhere to them. Of course, we never do. One of them is is the UN Charter. A way of dealing with ISIS, following the law, would be to approach the Security Council, request that they declare a threat to peace, which of course they would do, and organize a way to respond to it, and then follow the will of the international community. Out of that, there might come a reasonable response. The unilateral U.S. response, namely hit everything with a sledgehammer, makes absolutely no sense. The correspondent who's followed this most closely and has been right all along, Patrick Coburn, simply describes it as an Alice in Wonderland strategy. The major ground forces that are fighting ISIS are apparently the PKK and its allies in Syria, the similar group. They're barred because we call them a terrorist group. So they're under attack. Our ally Turkey attacks them and we bar them support. But they're apparently the ones who saved the Yazidi and blocked the ISIS attack on Iraqi Kurdistan, so they're out. The major regional force state that could confront ISIS is Iran. In fact, they could probably wipe them out. And they're influential in Iraq. In fact, they were the victors of the Iraq War. They're out for ideological reasons. A more complex case, actually, which Patrick Coburn's talked about, is what to do with Assad. And that has all kind of complexities, but anyway, they're out.
He's talked about it on this program.
And the sledgehammer has its usual effects. The bombings, U.S. bombings, are in the usual and predictable way eliciting anger from the civilians who are under attack. They don't like ISIS, they hate it, but they don't want to be attacked by American bombs. This is a perfect design for a kind of failure, though not necessarily a failure for the United States. It would be a failure for the people of the region. There was a very interesting insight into this in the New York Times maybe a week ago. The lead article should have had the headline, "The United States declares itself to be the world's leading terrorist state and is proud of it." That was the content of the article. Of course, it didn't have that headline. But it was very revealing, also the lack of response to it. The report is the lead story. It said it was a report of a CIA study that had just come out of U.S. interventions. And the study was concerned with when they worked and when they didn't work and why. And they quoted Obama as saying that he'd commissioned some such studies. He was kind of disappointed that they didn't work so much. Then you take a look at the examples. First paragraph of the story, 3 examples. Cuba, Angola, Nicaragua, each won a major terrorist war carried out by the United States. Not even ambiguous. So here we take 3 major terrorist wars, horrible consequences. We investigate, did they work or didn't they work? We're disappointed that they didn't work. And the president says, well, we have to find better ways. I mean, again, the headline should be, yes, we declare ourselves to be the world's leading terrorist state. We're proud of it.
It goes to a much bigger question. You talk often, as you just did, about the conventional wisdom being reality on its head. That goes back to the founding story of the United States.
Sure does.
Can you talk about the principles on which this country is supposedly founded versus the ones you think they might actually be founded on? I've been reading Edward Baptist's extraordinary book.
Well, take Baptist's book and compare it with the New York Times this morning. There's a description in the New York Times of the horrible treatment of the Yazidi by ISIS. Now go back to Baptist's book. That's what he's describing. He's describing the treatment of the slaves for half of American history, and in fact it continues, and it's almost identical. That's the way they were treated. That's part of our, and as he points out, it's not just kind of bad people in Georgia. Boston financiers were involved in it. They were, they didn't say they're in favor of slavery, but they were happy to become wealthy by exporting commodities that were produced by the leading resource of the 19th century, which was cotton. Cotton was kind of like oil. So the oil, the cotton gets exported, they make a ton of money in the banks, they have enough money to import, the country grows and becomes rich, and in fact, as Baptist says, the economy was built on the backs of African slaves.
So is capitalism, as you call it, wrecked, real existing capitalist democracy in the United States, redeemable, reformable?
Well, this is a good illustration of how remote our system is from capitalism. It's hard to think of any greater violation of capitalist and market principles than slavery. But the country was based on 2 basic commitments. One, slavery, which was, as Baptist points out, pretty much the source of the growing economy, including the industrial economy. The other is extermination of the indigenous population by state power. Now, what's that got to do with capitalism? And in fact, it goes right to the present. So if you have an iPhone and you take a look at the components in it, practically all of them were developed through the state sector. Government funding, research and development, often for decades.
Public sector, we paid for it.
Yeah, we pay for it. And notice there is a principle of capitalism. If you say we imagine we're in a capitalist society, and you invest money in something, and it's a risky investment, and you keep investing in it for decades, and finally something comes out that makes a profit. Well, in a capitalist society, you're supposed to get the profit. That's not what happens here.
If I'm the U.S. taxpayer,
you pay for decades, usually under the pretext that the Russians are coming or something. You're paying for the kind of research and development and creative work that yields the IT revolution, computers, the internet, your iPhone, all the rest of it. Do you get anything back?
Haven't noticed it.
Haven't noticed. It goes
Not
to
even
Steve Jobs and Bill Gates.
But we work a lot with people these days who are interested in trying to develop worker-owned co-ops and cooperative regions of solidarity economics. Is that hopeless?
No, I think that makes sense. In fact, there are interesting things happening. The person who's done most of the writing about this is Garl Perovitz. It's interesting work. Throughout the northern Middle West, like northern Ohio, there is a spread of worker-owned enterprises, not huge, but not small either, which could be the basis of a different kind of society. And notice that these could be substantial if there was enough popular support. So go back a couple of years. Obama virtually nationalized the auto industry. It was collapsing, so it had to be kind of bailed out by the taxpayer, usual story. So he took over most of the auto industry. There were a few possibilities. One possibility, of course, was the one that was followed. Bail out the owners, bail out the banks, give it back to the same people or other people, different faces, but essentially the same roles in society, and have it continue to produce what it had always been producing, automobiles. There was another possibility. Give it to the workforce, subsidize them to develop it, have it produce what we need. What do we need? I can give you a personal example. My wife and I came into New York by train from Boston. The train took only an hour and a half longer than when I took it in 1950 for the first time. Either it was standing still or it was going slower than the trucks on the Connecticut Turnpike. There isn't a country in the world where this happens. And that's just a symbol of the country. This is the richest country in the world, has incomparable advantages, and it's just falling apart.
Were you encouraged by the news that was hailed as a breakthrough of the U.S.-China accord around emissions? For the first time, China committing to cap emissions?
Well, it's not the first time. They'd already committed to it. I mean, there's a little adjustment in the dates. Look, it's better than nothing, but it doesn't really amount to much, and it has potential dangers that we ought to keep our eye on. Notice that this is a U.S.-China agreement. It could turn out that this is going to undercut the international agreements, and it's not impossible that that was the purpose. When we talk about Chinese emissions, remember, they're our emissions. China's manufacturers say your iPad, and there's pollution, but that's for the American markets. It's a mixed story.
Well, so that goes to the questions that we received from our Facebook friends. We invited them to pose questions of Professor Chomsky, and they posed very many. They fell into several camps. How did we get into this mess? How would you describe this mess? And how do we get out of this mess? I think we're at the how do you describe this mess situation. One question in particular was, how do you assess the strengths and weaknesses of the U.S. movements for social justice? And how would you advise we try to maximize the strengths and minimize the other?
Well, since the labor movement has traditionally been in the forefront of progressive social change, and for that reason and others, it's under severe attack. And by now, partly it's the fault of labor bureaucrats, but partly it's just a fierce attack from the business world, which pretty much runs the country. And by now, the labor movement is a shadow of what it once was. It could come back. There have been earlier periods of American history when labor was destroyed. 1920s, it was practically wiped out. 1930s, it rose again. Could happen. But with the labor movement very seriously weakened and independent political parties almost gone, there's a fundamental lack of continuity in activist politics. So everything starts from as if nothing ever happened before. So you have to take Occupy, which was important, but it came out of nowhere. No institutional memory, no recollection of the history, not even remembering how to run a demonstration. All of this kind of institutional memory is gone. There's a lot of activism, but it's very separated. I mean, one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing is just giving talks around the country. And one of the major positive contributions is it just brings people together in the same community. People who may be doing the same thing in different neighborhoods and don't know each other. And that extends across the country. What's happening here, nobody knows about there. That's a serious weakness.
One of the other questions we had from our Facebook page was from people asking about the prospects for a movement growing out of the conflict in Ferguson and the role of police and the militarization of our police in our society. Do you see any prospects for a broad anti-racist social justice movement coming out of that mobilization?
There are prospects, but it's going to be very hard. This is a very racist society. I mean, it's pretty shocking. And what has happened in the last roughly 30 years with regard to African Americans actually is very similar to what Baptist describes in the late 19th century. Remember what happened. The constitutional amendments during and after the Civil War were supposed to free African American slaves. It did something for about 10 years. Then there was a North-South Compact, which essentially granted the former slave-owning states the right to do whatever they wanted. And what they did was criminalize black life in all kinds of ways. That created a kind of a slave force. In fact, one of the most interesting books on it, Douglas Blackman's, is called Worse Than Slavery or something like that. It threw mostly black males, but also women, into jail, where they become a perfect labor force, much better than slaves. If you're a slave owner, you have to you have to keep your capital alive. If the state does it for you, it's terrific. No strikes, no disobedience, perfect labor force. A lot of the American Industrial Revolution in the late 19th, early 20th century is based on that. Actually, it pretty much lasted until the Second World War, when there was a need for what's called free labor in the war industry. After that come about two decades in which African Americans had a kind of a shot at entering the society. A black worker get a job in an auto plant. The unions were still functioning, maybe buy a small house, send his kid to college or something. By the 1970s or 80s, it's going back to criminalization of black life. It's called the drug war, which is a racist war. Ronald Reagan was an extreme racist, didn't hide it. And the whole drug war, so-called, is designed from policing up to eventual release from prison to make it impossible for the black male community and more women and more Hispanics to be part of the society. In fact, if you look at American history, the first slaves came in 1619. I mean, that's half a millennium. There have been about 3 or 4 decades in which African Americans had a limited degree of freedom. Not entirely, but at least some. Now, of course, it's For black elites, there's some privileges, but I'm talking about the mass of the population, which has been recriminalized and incidentally also turned into a slave labor force. There's prison labor, for example. Well, this is American history. To break out of that is no small trick. Yeah. In fact, if you take a look at the election, say the last election, in many ways it's a civil war. The red states of the Confederacy. It extends a little beyond, but that's pretty much what it is. Yeah. And of course, this is a real battle. I mean, these two founding crimes, slavery and extermination of the indigenous population, they're very much with us. Take a look at Indian reservations today. It's not a pretty sight.
People could talk a lot about what to do, but I do have to ask you one other important question that came out of Democracy Now! Yesterday. I don't know whether you heard, but rumors were spread of unseemly behavior by yourself at summer camp with Amy Goodman's father.
I read it. I didn't read it. Somebody sent it to me.
Russell Brand, the British actor comedian, wants to know, did you bite Amy Goodman's father's ear?
Afraid not. He was a friend. We were campers at a camp, and we were in the same bunk, and we were friends. We knew each other for a couple of years, but never got as close as biting his ear, I'm afraid.
No, thank you so much. It's great to have you.
Yeah.
Estás a la mitad del río y estás viendo México y estás viendo Estados Unidos y dices, wow, pero yo qué tengo que estar haciendo aquí. Ya llegas acá, te instalas y ves la verdadera situación de cómo es que se ganan los dólares, ¿no?
Decidimos llamar al Departamento de Labores a reportar todo lo que estaba sucediendo, pero ellos jamás llegaron.
Somos indocumentados. Pero eso no quiere decir que tengan que lucrar con el hambre de nosotros.
Cuando tenemos un contacto con el trabajador, somos muy explícitos. Estamos hablando de una lucha de poder.
Dijeron que cómo nos iban a dar los beneficios si nosotros no éramos ni siquiera una unión. Ahora van a tener su unión que ellos pedían.
Ganamos 12-8, güey.
Asociación de Trabajadores de Harry Krusty.
You never have more power than that as a worker in this country. He has to negotiate with you.
Hoy que ganamos, que tenemos la unión, ¿por qué ahora la compañía tiene que cerrar?
I mean, what happens when you have a group of workers who do everything by the book and then the boss just finds a way to screw them over anyway?
Cuando veo las noticias y que están ocupando el parque, digo, están locos, ¿qué están haciendo ahí?
Noam told me that he had Occupy Wall Street helping him out. And I'm afraid that he might get deported.
These workers are undocumented. They can lose everything. They should be leading the struggle and we should be taking their lead is my point. Not a bunch of kids.
Nosotros podemos poner una campaña y que se ocupe el lugar de trabajo.
O sea, no podemos estar 4 o 5 años dando flyers, ¿no?
They're supposed to be invisible. The food's supposed to arrive, but you're not supposed to see them.
We've been disrespected. We've been belittled. They feel like we are not better than 725, and we definitely are.
We need to stand behind each other. The middle class is evaporating. This is bullshit. 24-hour picket.
They're going against somebody who's trying to own something nice so that they can live well. It's horrible what's happening to business owners in this city.
You want to get rich? Go to work. Don't take a day off.
At this moment in the picket line, the morale of the workers are down. This one is about finding the right strategy that makes us to win.
Si vas a abusar de mis derechos, te vas a tener que atener a las consecuencias, porque ya no somos las mismas personas con los ojos cerrados de antes, ¿no?
people running these, running empire at this point speak exclusively in the language of violence and force. We've been brutalizing these people for over a decade. And we have decapitated through our drones, our aircraft, our missiles, far more people, including children, than ISIS has ever decapitated. And when you brutalize people to that extent, they become brutal.
The center of gravity of the movement was grassroots organizing, was frontline communities, was alliances between communities of color, indigenous communities, working class white folks. Like, you saw a different face of the movement.
We see this as a growing movement around systems change, not climate change.